Hello and welcome back to game number 10 of the series Masters of the Chessboard, where we are going through the famous Richard Reti's book Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in this book one at a time and going through Reti's analysis of these games. This game is the first game of Wilhelm Steinitz, and Reti offers a bit of analysis, a bit of an introduction to Steinitz. There are timestamps in the bottom of the video if you want to skip ahead to the actual game. But for here, I'll briefly summarize Reti's introduction to Steinitz and his playstyle. So we comment that Steinitz was born in 1836 in Prague, and in 1866 he played a match with Adolf Anderssen, where he won 8-6. There were no draws. After this, he was recognized as likely the strongest active player at the time. He then played in a series of international tournaments where it was recognized that both Steinitz and Johannes Zukertort were the two leading chess masters of the time. And in 1886 they met in the first official World Championship match, where Steinitz won with 10 wins, 5 draws and 5 losses. Steinitz went on to defend his title several times after this, notably against Chigorin in 1889, and unfortunately he was defeated by Lasker in 1892, who became the second world champion. After this defeat to Lasker, Steinitz continued to play competitively in tournaments, but he did not win any first prizes. He died in 1990, I believe. Now, in the previous chapter with Morphy, we saw a lot of open games, of which Morphy was the master of at the time. However, Steinitz was quite different. Steinitz tried to find a lot of rules and principles for playing closed positions, whereas Morphy would often seek the beautiful chess endings with the glory action-filled games, whereas Steinitz had no real issues playing a nice long defensive game in order to have a longer-term positional advantage. Now, this game is played in London in 1862, and Steinitz has the black pieces, and his opponent Dubois has the white pieces, and this is before Steinitz was the world champion. So white kicks off the game with e4, e5, knight f3, attacking the pawn, knight c6, defending the pawn, bishop c4, going into the Italian game, and bishop c5. And here white castled. Now, Reti comments that according to opening theory, at least opening theory according to the time of the book, it was considered better to not castle so early, because here, if you continue to develop all your pieces on the queen side, you'll then have the option of castling on the queen side or the king side. But the white player, regardless, castles, and here Reti does actually note that delaying castling wasn't really seen in Morphy's games, because Morphy would often play for a very rapid advance of the centre pawns to try and open up the game as quickly as possible. And so Morphy was consequently very keen to protect his king as soon as possible. But after castles, Steinitz plays knight f6, attacking the pawn, d3 defending, now d6. And here Reti comments that unlike his opponent, Steinitz correctly delays castling. He could have castled there, but instead he played d6. And now here the white player plays bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen. And Reti comments that if white knew the consequences of this move, he probably would have played something different. So we see h6, and the best move is probably bishop takes f6, but Dubois retreats to bishop h4, and then g5, and now Reti comments that we now see the consequence of white castling too early and black delaying the consequence. And Reti comments that an attack like this is only really possible because the centre is fully protected or closed. And so you don't really see a lot of attacks like this in Morphy's games because in those instances the centres were nearly always wide open. So we see bishop g3, h5, and white responds with h4. It's important to note knight takes g5 fails to h4, where if white was to try and get greedy and take on f7, we'll see in the book Reti gives this combination with h takes g3, sacrificing this queen, and bishop g4 is given in the book, attacking the queen. And after queen d2, interestingly, actually, in this position, the computer gives it as +6 initially. It only then reevaluates it to roughly about equal, actually. But we see queen at d2, and then knight to d4. And now, if we just have a normal developing move, it would be mate in 7, where after knight to f3, g takes f3, bishop takes f3. The only way to delay mate is to just sacrifice your pieces with like queen h6, something like bishop f7 check, bishop h5 is another way to just delay mate, and that's why it's mate in 7. Because now the mate is g takes h2, king f1, h1 queen. Or perhaps a bit more stylish, promoting to a rook. So that's why knight takes g5 fails, because after this little combination, we'll see this pawn come down and eventually turn into a queen and mate the king. So we see h4, stopping this pawn push. And now bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the queen. The combination so in the game we see c3. Reti comments that h takes g5 doesn't work due to h4. When after bishop h2, knight h7, black's got quite a strong attack. If we show what black's threats are by just giving white a bit of a passing move, then we'll see something like knight takes g5, creating a double attack on here. So if white plays to try and defend this knight, then we'll see h3. Taking this would lead to a very quick end. After something like rook takes h3, the king's wide open, all the pieces are ready to come, and we could see something like this, or there's a lot of options here for black. If instead we see something like g3, avoiding this pawn capturing, then after knight takes f3, knight takes queen f6, there aren't really many options. The computer's move here is c3, just giving away this knight for free. So that's the threats. After h takes g5, we'll see h4, and then this knight circling round to g5. That's a lot of the threats in this position and why h takes g5 isn't played. So instead, we see c3, and here white's preparing a counter-attack in the centre and is hoping to try and kick this bishop around a bit. Steinitz responds with queen at d7 and d4. And this is it doesn't work, but it's quite principled. You are meeting an attack on the flank with a counter-attack in the centre. That's a common principle, and although it doesn't work, I think it's a very good idea. I quite like White's play here for trying to do this counter-attack in the centre, especially because Black's king isn't yet castled. But we see d4 attacking the bishop, e takes d4, and now e5 attacking the knight. After d takes e5, we see bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, attacking the queen and potentially this bishop. We see queen to f5, and now the counter-attack in the centre is ended. White hasn't really got anything else they can really do in the centre. So Steinitz has successfully defended against his counter-attack, and now with his queen and f5, his attack is quite a bit more intense. Now here we see knight takes g4, h takes g4, so White's just trying to take away some of the attacking pieces, and it's important to note the queen was hanging. Then we see bishop to d3, attacking the queen, queen to d5, and now b4. And Reti comments that b4 has the intention of, after bishop b6, c5 forcing the queen to move, and then c6 would trap the bishop, because there's a bishop here with pawns here covering all of the retreat squares. So b5 is meant to force the bishop away. However, Black instead just gives up this bishop. His attack is decided instead on his h-file. That's where Steinitz has got his eye, on this h-file. And this bishop doesn't really contribute to the attack on the h-file, so he just gives it up. And instead, he castles. And so this is move 17, and Reti comments that this capturing of this giving up of the bishop, the idea of it becomes quite evident on move 22. So I'll bring attention to that when we get to there. White play responds with c4, hoping to try and stop the queen controlling this f5 square, and also try to take the queen off this long diagonal. This long diagonal, and this long diagonal. So by trying to take the queen off this long diagonal, it gives the white the option of playing g3 without the queen eyeing up this g2 square. So we see queen to c6 trying to stay on at this diagonal, and now b takes c5, taking the bishop. And now rook takes h3, and now we're seeing the whole idea. This rook is going to come down here and threaten the mate. That's the threat. So the white player plays f3, trying to get a bit of air for his king. And again, the threat is this rook coming down here, potentially pushing his pawn maybe, and getting this mate in. And that's what we see. We see rook d to h8, f takes g4, and now we see queen to e8. Perhaps worth noting, knight takes g4 loses to this, when the knight's got two attackers and only one defender. So we see queen e8, and now queen e1, going for the trade of queens, which again is quite principled. And now we see queen e3 check, the point of the combinations of giving up this bishop. And this is the move 22, and it's the point of the combinations which we see. So here the queen takes, and the queen has to take. Even though the queen is defended, it can't block the check because rook h1 mate is coming. So the queen has to take, because this king needs this escape square. D takes e3, and now again this pawn is covering this f2 square, threatening mate. So we see g3 to try and get some air, so the king can escape up here. But after rook h1, king to g2, rook 8 h2 check, king f3, rook takes f1 check, bishop takes f1, now rook f2 check, and rook takes here. We now get into a winning endgame for black. Now, this is where the game in the book actually ends, and Reti comments that due to the white pieces being just completely paralyzed and stuck due to this pin on the back rank, it's quite evident that black is just white can't win this game at all with these pieces like this, especially with his ruined pawn structure. Like, he's got an isolated pawn here, he's got two double pawns, and he's got two double pawns. Whereas black's pawn structure is actually really quite nice. So here the game ends. The game ends in the book, sorry, but the endgame itself does go on for a little bit longer. And I'll quickly play the moves of the endgame. We see a4, king d7, king d3, knight takes g4, then king c3, we see knight to e3, rook a2, rook takes b1, so white sacrificed this knight to try and get the rook out, rook to d2 check, king c6, rook e2, we see rook c1 check, king d2, rook c2 check, king takes e3, rook takes e2, king takes e2. And now we are in a king and pawn endgame, except in most king and pawn endgames, the side with the better structure is generally speaking the better player. And here, black is a pawn up. This king is ready to eat up some of these pawns and very quickly create a passed pawn here. And with three separate pawn islands, two lots of double pawns, this game is simply lost for white. So we do see a few more moves. f5, king e3, king takes c5, king d3, and f4. And here, so here the white player resigns, and after g takes f4, g takes f4, it's quite clear. Black can just push this pawn, and the white player will have no choice but to spend a few moves trying to capture it. So after something like e4, we can have king takes c4. And after they take here, this is just an easily won endgame for black. Three connected passed pawns against the king is very easily won. And so that's game number 10 of the book, but also game number 1 of Steinitz. And it's the first time we do see a position with a more closed centre like this. We've seen one of the Anderson games where there was an isolated pawn and he blockaded it with a knight. But this is the first time when we see a bit more of a common position that you might get in a lot of amateur games, where there is a bit more of a closed centre where everything's protected, except Steinitz manages to use this to his advantage by delaying castling and creating a counter-attack on the queen side, on the king side. So that's it then. That's game number 10. We've got quite a few games of Steinitz. I don't know how many, but I think there's quite a few for Steinitz, which is quite good because I don't know much about Steinitz personally. So if you liked this video, please like, comment and subscribe. If you've got any feedback, please let me know. And other than that, I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.